The time on the clock is, I believe it's going to Mr. Barrett. Mr. Genuis, is it back to you, or is it over to your colleague? Yes,
to me.
Pardon me. Back to Mr. Genuis. Ms. Kalita, is this a point of order?
Chair,
Yes.
Just a point of clarification. My understanding is, according to the standing orders, that once somebody moves a motion, that it passes to the next speaker in line. I just wanted to confirm that. I'm not 100% sure.
I'll check on that. That's not been the practice of the committee, but if I have been, if I'm incorrect, I will get back. I'll check with the clerk on that one. Thank you. I'm informed that it is not in the standing orders. It is at the chair's discretion, and my practice has been to, for all members from all parties, to suspend the clock when we move into a debate, and then return to that once the debate is concluded. So, Mr. Genuis, you do have 5 minutes and 30 seconds now. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Chair. Just to say, first of all, I'm very glad to see that motion passed. I will say Ms. Shanahan's comments are totally incorrect, and I think they ignore Ms. Daly's testimony. She made very serious allegations about intimidation of her as part of an internal government process, a process that clearly is compromised and subject to criticism. So for after hearing those 2 hours of testimony, Ms. Shanahan to say, we should just trust the internal process doesn't make much sense to me. We're parliamentarians. Our job is to hold government accountable, and that's what the passage of this motion, which clearly had the support of the opposition and in the end passed unanimously, that's what it allows us to do, is get to the bottom of what happened. So to the Ethics Commissioner, thank you very much again for being here. Clearly there are major ethical issues involved in the Arrive scam scandal. You've talked about your jurisdiction, that is applying to certain people and others. I just want to dig into that. So some of the facts we have heard at this committee, as well as the Government Operations Committee, are serious allegations about Min Doan deleting emails, as well as a conflict of interest issue involving Mr. David Yao, who was a contractor while he was working for the government, who's essentially double dipping. And we've dug further into that. We've looked for further information about this practice of people double dipping as government employees and as contractors. We put forward a motion calling for the end of this double dipping, and it passed with the support of all opposition parties, although Liberals opposed that. Could you help us understand whether or not these issues involving David Yao, the double dipping questions, as well as the deletion of emails, allegations involving Min Doan, whether or not those would fall under your jurisdiction to deal with, and why or why not?
Thank you. No, they do not fall under my jurisdiction. Basically, my jurisdiction is to deal with issues of conflict of interest. Conflict of interest by elected officials like yourself, or by people who are what the Act calls reporting public office holders, which are basically people who are appointed by governor and council and have a senior position. And in this case, all the people you mentioned, none of them falls under either category. So there are obviously other institutions who deal with it. Primarily the Commissioner of Public Service Integrity deals with it. There are provisions under the Public Service Employment Act, etc. These are all activities which we like double dipping, etc., which clearly are not ethical and shouldn't be pursued, but they're not part of my mandate.
Okay, thank you. So on the double dipping front, you said clearly not ethical, but only triggers your involvement depending on what level. So if we had a case where a member of parliament or a very senior public servant was involved in this double dipping, they owned a company that was bidding on government contracts at their own department even perhaps, while they were also holding this position, that would trigger your involvement. But it's not a question of the activity itself. It's a question of the level of the person that is doing that activity. Is that correct?
I can only deal with issues that involves senior public servants appointed by order in council or elected members of the House of Commons.
Okay, thank you. So I guess a way of getting at this issue would be to ask a hypothetical then, which is that if you had a senior public servant or a member of parliament who owned a company that was bidding on government contracts, presumably you would have concerns about that, right? Or would you? I don't know to put words in your mouth. How would you respond to that?
Excuse me. First of all, that senior public servant in your hypothetical would have to disclose all of this in his report when he's appointed, or if it happens during his tenure while he acquires it. We would deal with them. Does this create a conflict or not, and what are the remedies that is it? Do you have to get rid of the company? Do you have to put it in a public trust, in a blind trust, or whatever? And secondly, a member of the House of Commons can ask me to investigate. In either case, I would look at it, and then if I find out there are grounds for launching reasonable grounds for there being a breach of the Act, then I will launch an investigation. If I come across something that is criminal or potentially criminal, I have to refer it over to the RCMP and seize my activities. So that the criminal aspect, if there is any, can be resolved.
Okay, so just in the last 10 seconds I have, sir, it does seem that comparing your description of what would be appropriate to what happened with, for instance, David Yao, it's clear that based on your expertise, there are serious ethical problems because there was a lack of disclosure in the case of David Yao. Again, it's not within your jurisdiction to investigate him specifically, but I think the information you're providing about what would be considered ethical or not in the case of people you would investigate is very helpful in the area of double dipping. So thank you for that testimony.
Excuse me just for 1 second. Mr. von Finkenstein, could you just either move your microphone forward or just stand back a little bit? Your proximity is just creating a little bit of feedback, which is difficult for the interpreters. So maybe say a few words. We can just double check it.
Is this better? Can you hear me now clearly, interpreter?
I'll look to the interpreters. Is that a little better for the... Back a little bit more? Maybe back a little bit more, or push the microphone further away from you, or even push the box away from you. So,
is this better? Can you hear me now clearly?
I'm getting thumbs up. Thank you very much, Commissioner. Mr. Jennings, pardon me, Mr. von Finkenstein.
I think I have 10 minutes left, right?
No, you. Mr. von Finkenstein, do you have any comments for Mr. Genuis?
No,
I felt it was more of a
question, I believe.
I didn't think there was a question there as well. Okay, I just want to double check with you. Ms. Yip, you have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and I'd like to thank the witnesses for coming today and for your patience while we dealt with the motion. For Canadians at home, Commissioner, what is the role of an ethics commissioner?
As I mentioned, although the title is Conflict of Interest and Ethics, it really is primarily to deal with conflicts of interest. And obviously, when you do that, you look at you have ethical consideration. But the main thing is to make the Act quite clearly provides that people who have an elected position in the House of Commons, or people under the Code or under the Act, if you are an appointed official to a senior public service commission, you have to behave ethically. You can't further your own interests, the interests of your friends or family, etc., or use your job in a way to favor somebody, etc. And that's what I concentrate on. But the way this system works is that, in effect, at the beginning of your appointment, you make a report. We look at it and say, there's a problem here, there's a problem there, etc., and suggest ways that can be remedied. Then throughout the tenure, the person annually makes an update of that report. And our job is to, as I mentioned many times before, to ensure that the best talent can come into the public service and out. If you're good, if you're talented, you will have conflicts. There's no doubt about it. The question is how to manage it. And my job is there to manage it and try to avoid conflicts. And then in the instances where there is behavior that seems to be suspicious and gives reasonable grounds to investigation, I can do it either on my own initiative or if requested by a member of the Parliament.
Is your office part of the House of Commons or the government?
Yes, I am. I report to the Speaker of the House, and my office is part of the House of Commons and subject to the rules of the House of Commons.
Are you an independent officer of the House of Commons?
Yes.
Perhaps you could elaborate on that?
Well, if you look at the Act and, excuse me, and the Code, basically it gives a huge amount of discretion to the Commissioner to decide what is the conflict, what behavior that can be permitted, or what are the remedies that should be applied. If the person to whom I give these directions refuses to do it, or it thinks they have an issue with it and I am wrong, they can go to the federal court and ask for judicial review of the decision. Other than that, nobody looks and has an ability to tell me how to decide or criticize or ask me to take back a decision or anything. I'm completely independent, but I report publicly everything I do to the Speaker of the House of Commons, and of course I publish an annual report.
Thanks for making that clear. Have you opened an investigation into the ArriveCAN procurement?
I have not, because for what I just told your colleague, I have no jurisdiction. My jurisdiction is over people who are appointed by order in council and are what the Act calls a reporting public office holder. None of the people involved so far that have been mentioned, either in the AG's report or in the public proceedings before you, qualify as reporting public office holders. So I have no jurisdiction to look into it and investigate.
So you do not have any reason to believe that any member of Parliament, minister, or their staff have violated the Conflict of Interest Act or Code through this procurement?
Indeed, that's exactly it, and nobody has furnished any evidence or pointed up anything that would seem to involve what we, as the Act calls, a reporting public office holder.
Okay. Do you believe that any member of the Liberal government has personally benefited from the selection of any ArriveCAN contractors?
It's not a question of what I believe or not believe. I deal with evidence. I have to look at a situation and find, on the basis of evidence, whether there has been a violation of the Act or not. As I say, so far I don't have any jurisdiction. If I had jurisdiction, then I would have to look at the facts presented and decide whether there are reasonable grounds to make an investigation, and if so, I would do an investigation. But that's very far away from where we are right now.
So just to be clear, there's no investigation into this because you don't believe anyone has violated the Act or the Code?
There's no investigation because I don't have jurisdiction. My jurisdiction depends on people who are reporting public office holders. There's no evidence, no referral to any public office holder who has been involved in this. Hence, I cannot investigate. I have no jurisdiction to do anything. If and when such evidence emerges, then I have to decide whether it warrants an investigation or not.
So is that your threshold that needs to be met for your office to open an investigation?
Well, first of all, I have to have jurisdiction, number one. And then the Act says there have to be reasonable ground for me to believe that an investigation is required.
Et voilà. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. Suivant, c'est Madame.
Up next is Ms. Sinclair de Gagné for 6 minutes, please. Hello, Commissioner. Thank you for being with us today. Well, I will start my line of questioning by reminding the importance of your role, because a lack of ethical adherence is not the equivalent of something being illegal. And when you look at conflicts of interest and ethical situations of ethics, it's interesting because it's not necessarily illegal, but clearly in some cases there are ethical problems in the behavior of some, for instance. So my first question to you will be the following. The most common
élu ou ce genre de choses.
Just a second, Ms. Sinclair Degania, because we lost you. Your screen froze for a couple seconds. So if you could just restart your question, please. Of course. When it comes to conflicts of interest, we often think about financial conflicts of interest. So, for instance, someone has an interest, they own a company, and they're at the same time an elected official or appointed by the government, and in that case, there might be a conflict of interest. But I'd like to hear your opinion on the following. Should the conflict of interest be absolutely financial in nature? If there is a position that is sought sought after, or there's a high-ranking official that is appointed by the government, and this person being nominated to this position might also trigger other conflicts of interest of the type that are not necessarily financial. Is that the case? Of course, there might be conflicts of interest that are not financial in nature. But when you look at the definition of conflict of interest for the application of this act, an appointed official or an elected official is considered to be in a conflict of interest when they are considered to be driving personal benefit by having access to their position that would otherwise not be available to other people. So that is the crux of the matter. So is there an interest that this person in question is deriving compared to someone else just because they are in a certain position? The definition is very strict. We're not talking about the general ethical framework. We're talking about the actions of appointed or elected officials who might be in a favorable situation compared to others. Okay. And you also said at the outset that you scrutinize elected and appointed officials. Does that include presidents of agencies and deputy ministers who are nominated by the government? Yes, they are included. So, hypothetically speaking, there could be conflicts of interest in a situation where the person occupying a position, a deputy minister, let's say, if they ask that something like arrive can is to be shelved or to be forgotten, if the arrive can situation is not resolved and this person stays in their position, would that be a type of conflict of interest? It depends on the facts. What would be the purpose of the actions of this deputy minister and how do they benefit from these actions? So we would need to be asking these questions. Is it because there is pressure and potential retaliation? But that's, again, not part of my jurisdiction. That would go to another commissioner. But if you can establish a connection with the actions of this individual and a personal benefit or outcome that benefits the deputy minister, at that point in time, yes, I could be involved. Because yesterday we had testimony that was quite troubling in the sense that, and I'm not saying the witness was right in that position, but a deputy minister's name was invoked, and the argument was that this person would have a certain benefit in the arrive can situation and that they would be in favor of making sure that people forget about this situation. So would that be a conflict of interest in terms of their professional integrity? Who is in charge of ethics issues or conflicts of interest issues when it comes to public servants who are not appointed? I think it will be the Commissioner of Public Integrity. And it also depends on the facts. Maybe the public service also has a similar function, but that wouldn't be part of our mandate or jurisdiction. Mr. Chair, how much time do I have left? None. And that's it. You had 0 seconds left. And up next, we have Mr. Desjardins.
Or for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the Commissioner and the Legal Counsel representative for being with us today. I know many of the questions that were posed in relation to ArriveCAN you've already answered, largely comments about it being out of your jurisdiction. Is that fair summation?
Yeah. Yes, and what happens there is, I know in no way condone it or think it's minimal or anything like that. It's just not part of my jurisdiction.
No, I understand that. And so for those purposes, I want to turn to a particular ethical issue that is placating Canada at the moment, which I think was also highlighted in the ArriveCAN issue, which is Indigenous procurement. Adjacent to Indigenous procurement, there are serious issues of pretendianism, quote unquote. This issue of officials and even members of parliament and other elected officials across the country claiming to be Indigenous for the purposes of trying to benefit in some way, shape, or form from doing that. As an Indigenous member of parliament, myself, I'm troubled by what has been a consistent and ongoing effort to use Indigenous identity as a tool, which is deeply troubling for Indigenous nations across the country, including my own, and many others that we work with. And so it's really troubling to know that this is happening. It seems to me as though this could fall within your mandate in the future, a way or a tool for us to combat pretendianism, because it is being used by public officials and it is being used by members of parliament at times in order to deflect or to even protect themselves from claims of very legitimate racism. And so it's a concern to me, and I think a concern to the public. We've seen this in the last few years, for example, very high-ranking or high-profile persons in Canada and across the United States we had to get giant news agencies to investigate whether or not they were truly Indigenous, and they found out that they weren't after decades of benefiting from identity fraud. In Canada, there was even a severe case of 2 students attempting to identify themselves as Indigenous for the purposes of getting benefits there. And so it's a growing concern, and I hope, Commissioner, you can understand Indigenous people's very legitimate fear of identity fraud. And this is something that I think that requires more thought, more investigation, and more understanding, and also cooperation with Indigenous nations towards a way or a program or a process to verify when officials are in fact using identity as a weapon or using it as a tool of fraud in order to advance themselves. Is this something that concerns you at all, particularly within the ethics and conflict of interest laws?
Yeah, of course, it's of great concern and something that needs to be addressed and dealt with. It's unfortunately, it does not fall under my jurisdiction. You use the word fraud, identity fraud. If it truly is fraud, then it becomes a criminal offense. If it's just misrepresentation or something else, it may not amount to criminal, but it still should not be allowed and should be and to my knowledge, there is no specific program that addresses it as such. It is the part of the general ethics of procurement, trying to make sure that people play by the rules or not. And I'm not a procurement expert. I don't know to what extent the verification process needs to be tightened or needs to be improved or not.
I heard you respond to one of my colleagues about a framework of understanding that you come to in identifying conflict of interest. I think you, if I can fairly say it, you attributed it to a claim and an action that could, in fact, put them into a position where they would unduly benefit. Could you please describe again what is a conflict of interest, in particular with the angle of seeing it as using Indigenous identity, even in the act of fraud, which is a criminal offense, but also in the act of conflict of interest, could be something within your purview, within the framework you understand as a conflict of interest?
You know, it all depends on the definition of the conflict of interest. And as I've pointed out to your colleague, it has to be an action in exercise of official power, duty, or function that provides an opportunity to further his or her private interest, or those of his or her relatives or friends, or improperly further another person's interest. Now, given the situation which you posit, involving somebody impersonating to be Indigenous when he is not, and therefore getting the contract, it is the action of that person. It's not necessarily of the action of the person who gives them the contract. So therefore, I don't see quite how conflict of interest applies. It is clearly an action that should not be allowed, that should be prevented or prosecuted. But it doesn't really fit into the whole concept of conflict of interest.
Beyond the concept of conflict of interest, your office deals with issues of ethics. As far as your understanding of the process of identifying an ethical issue, which I believe this to be an ethical issue of falsely identifying as Indigenous for the political, personal, and private benefit of attempting to displace one's own racist actions, for example, or one's own perceived racist actions in order to deflect or even to benefit from what could be a very racist claim, but is negated because of a claim of it being Indigenous. This is something that exists in the personal world and the political world. And as far as your standards of ethics and understanding of ethics, does that breach or broach any kind of responsibility or effort that your office can undertake to better prevent that from happening?
Let's start with the beginning of your question. You said we administer ethics. We do not. We administer conflict of interest, and in doing so, we follow ethical principles. Although the title of the office is Commissioner of Public Interest, of Conflict of Interest and Ethics, there's not a single provision that uses the word ethics or deals with ethics. It is sort of the tough subtext to all that we're doing. Why are we doing this? To make sure that people have confidence in the Canadian government and it's done ethically. But we don't have any specific activity mandated to look at the ethics, etc. There are all sorts of other government or institutions, but it really isn't part of our job.
What institution would you
Mr.
recommend?
Daisley, I'm afraid that we've exceeded the time. I appreciate it. We'll come back to you certainly.
Okay, thank you,
turning now to the